Welcome back to our final panel. And our final panel is International Response and Solidarity. This panel underscores the importance of collective action and global solidarity in addressing systemic gender-based persecution. It highlights the role of international organizations, governments, and civil society in advocating for the rights and dignity of those who are subjected to gender-based persecution and apartheid. And our moderator for this panel will be James Yap, who is an international human rights lawyer and the interim director of the International Human Rights Program at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. He holds a Juris Doctor from Osgoode Hall Law School and a Master of Laws from Yale Law School. James represents plaintiffs in all kinds of human rights and social justice claims with a focus on cases that raise novel and complex issues of transnational justice. Over to you, James.
Like working. Oh, now it is. Okay, great. Thank you, Payam, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'm very pleased to be here today to moderate the last panel on this Friday afternoon on gender persecution and women's rights in Afghanistan and Iran. So joining me today, I'm going to introduce our speakers. The first speaker to my right is the Honorable Senator Salma Ataullajan, and she is the first Canadian senator of Pakistani origin. She is currently chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights, where she proposed several recognized studies showing her commitment to issues affecting women, youth, and the world's most vulnerable. Recently, she spearheaded the first study on Islamophobia in Canada conducted by the Senate. And then next to speak, joining us by remote link, and who will appear on the screen shortly, is Elyas Irfani, advisor to Canada's Special Representative to Afghanistan, Global Affairs Canada. And that's the biographical information that I have. Okay, and then our third speaker will be Anna-Pála Sverrisdóttir, who is a, okay. I have the phonetic pronunciation on the sheet, so I've got a bit of a cheat sheet here. Is a counselor at the Permanent Mission of Iceland to the UN in New York. She is a former vice chair of the General Assembly Legal Committee and currently co-facilitator on crimes against humanity. Outside the Foreign Service, her roles have included the presidency of Iceland's National LGBTI Association and part-time lecturing on women's law at the University of Iceland. Okay, so as I said, we'll start with the Honorable Senator Salma Ataullajan. Salma, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. You introduced me, I'm Salma Ataullajan, originally born in Pakistan, northern Pakistan. By race, I am an Afghan, and those of you who are familiar with the history of that area will know that where the Afghans were divided by the border, you have Afghans, ethnic Pashtun, I'm a Pashtun in Pakistan, and they're in Afghanistan. The history of my family is intertwined with the history of Afghanistan and India. Our great-grand-uncle was Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, one of the biggest and most well-known freedom fighters in that part of the world. He was a friend and compatriot of Gandhi's. So I grew up in a home where there was political discourse all the time. And I think under Nikababa, which means grandfather, the first time that the Pashtuns ever did peaceful protests. And that's a story for another day. So when I was appointed to the Senate in 2010, as the new senator, my concern has always been for the women of Afghanistan. And I proposed a study in the Human Rights Committee. I've been on the Human Rights Committee since 2010 on what happens to the rights and gains made by the women in Afghanistan. Because Canada was preparing to leave Afghanistan, and I was concerned. And a decade later, we were having the same conversations. We knew things weren't right in 2022. I was the president of the Canada-Afghan Friendship Group, and I see my sister shaking her head. We had calls with the parliamentarians. There was four ministers on that Zoom call, if you remember. And I heard one of the women say, you know, because everyone's saying, oh, well, we're thinking of you, our thoughts are with you, our prayers are with you. And she said in Pashto, which is my mother tongue, so I could understand, she said, you know, we need more than thoughts and prayers because the Taliban are coming. Unfortunately, we failed the women of Afghanistan. We walked away. And the world has forgotten about Afghanistan and the women of Afghanistan. Last year, I tabled a motion, which is on the floor of the Senate, asking for this government to recognize what is happening in Afghanistan as gender apartheid. You know, this government has a feminist agenda. It always talks about the rights of women and girls, especially where Afghanistan is concerned. So we're just trying to put some pressure on them that they should recognize that. I've done so much work on Afghanistan, and forgive me, I just got off a flight from Bahrain. I was in Bahrain for 2 days and came back this morning, but it was so important for me to be here because Afghanistan, Iran, and any issue, human rights issue, and especially women's issue, I know how hard it is for women from Afghanistan, women from Iran. You know, it's like one step forward and 10 backwards. And so last year, exactly a year ago, I was in Bahrain for the IPU, the Interparliamentary Union. And there was the young gentleman who was running for a position. He was a parliamentarian. He wanted to represent the young parliamentarians in the parliamentarians group. And I stood up. The Massa Amini case had just happened. And I said, listen, I have a question for this parliamentarian. And they said, yes, what is it? And I said, do you realize when you are going to be standing there speaking on behalf of parliamentarians, it includes women too. You don't have the courage to defend the women in your own country. How are you going to come and defend women internationally? They weren't happy with me. He turned to me and he said, well, lots of bad things happen to women in Canada. And I said, let's get serious about what happens to women in Canada. I had kept asking the government questions in the Senate because the aid agencies and NGOs, they couldn't do work in Afghanistan because under Canadian law, if you did work in Afghanistan or you sent money to Afghanistan and taxes were paid to the Taliban, which, you know, most government get taxes paid to them, you could be charged under Canada's terrorism laws, which meant 10 years in prison. So I would ask the question because where we sit, we ask the questions, we quite often don't get the answers, but I continue to ask questions. I feel if you ask the questions, you're heard. And in this case, there was a journalist who heard me and he came and then he started asking the minister. And the result was a bill C-41, which came to the Human Rights Committee then. And we sat and looked at it in one sitting. We had the minister there and I asked him, I said, Minister, your intentions are good, but do you have the staff? Do you have the means to deal with this? And he said, yes, I do. Well, this was December. We are in March and it still has not been implemented. Yeah, we have a problem. I just, I wrote some stuff down. The other thing is that even when Canada was there, I used to always insist that women should be part of the peace projects. The Taliban is the only government in the world whose public policy is complete erasure of women from public life. They have, 80 edicts, most of them against women. They don't want any female doctors, yet they don't want women going to male doctors. You know, girls can get an education till grade 6 only. And as someone who traveled extensively in Afghanistan before the Taliban came, I mean, I remember the days where women were equal. They never had to fight for their rights. The women in Afghanistan got the right to vote in 1919. Women owned businesses. They stood side by side with the men. And the last time I went was in 1978. And the stories we've heard, the floggings that we saw, the beheading that we saw, the week before, I think there was something like three beheadings. So the story of Afghanistan is a difficult story, and I'm very despondent because I don't see any improvement. The world has forgotten about Afghanistan. And thank you for organizing this, because it's events like this that bring attention back to Afghanistan, bring attention to Iran, because the world moves on. There's different headlines, and people start talking about different issues. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to our conversations.
Thank you so much, Senator. So the format of this talk is, after each presenter, I'm just going to ask, a few questions and get a little bit of a conversation going. And then after each presenter has gone, we're going to try and have a bit of a conversation among the three panelists. And so first off, something you said, well, I guess a couple times, sort of struck me when you talked about the world forgetting about the women of Afghanistan. So could you perhaps sort of elaborate more on that? Do you feel the world has forgotten about the women of Afghanistan?
The world has forgotten about Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan. 95%, to just put things in perspective, 95% of people in Afghanistan are malnourished. And those of us who are familiar with Kabul, we know, and Afghanistan, we know the winters can be brutal. And when I was working on what was Bill 41, C-41, is we wanted it passed before the winter, because we knew how critical that was. We know how many lives that would save. So when I say the world has forgotten about Afghanistan, most people have forgotten about Afghanistan. When was the last time we heard about any kind of news about Afghanistan? And they need support, because until we don't carry the conversations, until we don't hold the Taliban responsible, until we don't remind them of what they're doing to the women in Afghanistan. I heard that they wanted to establish ties with Canada, the Taliban. I mean, on what basis? What have you done?
And why do you suppose the world has forgotten about the women of Afghanistan, if you could speculate?
There's many reasons, different headlines. The world moves on. Something else happens, and the world moves on. At some level, let's be frank, if you're a racialized woman, you're easily forgotten. The challenges that we feel, that as a racialized person, even now, and I had such a horrible email today, and I don't want this to be about me, but my colleague was asking a question about Israel, and I got a message that my office needed to speak to me. I got up and walked away, and I'm being singled out, Muslim chair of human rights. Choice words that I don't want to repeat over here. There's a different set of rules for racialized women than there's for others. And as a new senator, I always used to say that to some of my colleagues. Would say, "Oh, you don't need to do this. Come along with us." And I used to say, "No, you can get away with it. I cannot get away with it." I'm being very blunt. It's Women's Day. We're having a frank conversation. So the women in Afghanistan, maybe they don't matter anymore. And I'm not saying that's true for everyone, but a lot of people have chosen to forget about the women of Afghanistan.
And we'll have time for questions afterwards. I got an email from, I think, one of your colleagues that's saying that you had tabled a motion recently. Was that Bill C-40? Or is that? Okay, do you want to perhaps talk about that?
So my motion is to ask this government to what's happening to the women in Afghanistan should be labeled as gender apartheid. Bill C-41 was the one where because a lot of our allies like UK, Germany, they all amended their laws, to let aid agencies and NGOs work in Afghanistan without being charged under the terrorism law. So we were pressing the government to do that. And something unprecedented happened in the Senate of Canada when this bill, so the way it works is that you have a bill, it comes from the House, a C bill, it comes to the Senate, it's debated, it goes to the committee. We took it to the committee, we were done with it in one hearing. The minister came, others came, and we did, the hearing. We brought it back to the Senate, and generally people speak to it, the second hearing and third hearing, and we said no. We're going to do second hearing and third hearing in one moment. I've been in the Senate since 2010. It's the first time that happened, because Afghanistan has a lot of friends in the Senate of Canada who were very concerned about what's happening to the women. We're very concerned about what's happening to the people of Afghanistan. And here is something else, is that when we have these conversations about the women in Afghanistan, a lot of times we're looking at the cities, and the rural women are forgotten in the equation. Even when the countries like the US and NATO, when they were there, and whenever we had any hearing or anything on Afghanistan, I would always ask, has life changed for the rural women? Because we hear about, the women in the cities, they're going to universities, they have access to healthcare, they, are sort of moving around freely. But the very little change for the women in rural Afghanistan, and now it's gotten worse. I mean, women in Afghanistan can't go out unless they have a male companion. What if you're a widow? And we've heard stories. I had a call from a student about 2 months ago, a 20-year-old. She had gotten admission in one of the Canadian universities, and she was saying, begging me for help. She said, help me to come to Canada. I didn't know what to say to her. I had one young mother who was threatening self-harm unless I could get her out. And that was a terrible burden for me to bear, because we do as much as we could. My office was inundated with emails. We did manage to help some people. And there was one journalist who told me, as much as I would like to leave Afghanistan, can you help my nephew, because he was already kidnapped by the Taliban, and he jumped out of the van and he's in hiding. So, I mean, there's story after story of heartbreak, of hardship. And I feel very powerless, because there's very little I can do.
A lot of us feel the same way. Well, thank you, Senator, for sharing and for your candor. Let's all thank the Honorable Senator. Next speaker, Elyas Irfani. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm based in Doha, Qatar, and I work with Canada's Special Representative for Afghanistan, David Spruill. I'll offer a few brief comments on the situation of Afghan women and girls, but focus my comments more on a new political roadmap process that's being proposed by the United Nations, which is designed to bring about coordinated international action in relation to Afghanistan. Presenters today have noted how the Taliban administration has introduced new policies, implemented significant political and social changes, which are aligned with the Taliban's vision of creating an Islamic emirate. In this process, the Taliban have created one of the world's most repressive governments, especially for Afghan women and girls. And regrettably, the situation is getting worse. The Taliban, of course, when they came to power in August of 2021, expected international recognition. But their deplorable treatment of women and girls is a main reason why they're not recognized as Afghanistan's legitimate government. Broadly speaking, a set of common international priorities, conditions, or you can call it expectations, have emerged for normalization of relations with the Taliban or the reintegration of Afghanistan in the international community. However, there is little consensus on the hierarchy of these priorities. This has impeded strong collective international action. For the community of so-called like-minded countries, which consists of the main donors and Western countries, humanitarian assistance and women's rights are among the top priorities. This is certainly the case for Canada, which has been among the top 10 donors to Afghanistan and which advocates strongly for the full realization of Afghan women's and girls' rights at every opportunity. However, Afghanistan's neighbors and influential regional actors tend to have different priorities, such as regional security and economic cooperation. This divergence in priorities has weakened the international community's leverage in respect to the Taliban. Taking advantage of this situation, the Taliban are trying to enhance relations with the region through bilateral agreements with little expectation on their part to reverse these repressive policies. But there is potentially good news. As many of you are aware, the United Nations has proposed a new political roadmap for normalization of relations with Afghanistan with clear expectations. The proposed roadmap is based on recommendations of an independent assessment report by the UN Special Coordinator, which was submitted to the UN Security Council late last year. Last month, on the 18th of February, the UN Secretary General convened a large meeting of special representatives of Afghanistan in Qatar with the participation of 27 countries, including Canada, and international organizations such as the OIC, as well as Afghan civil society members. At this meeting, participants broadly supported the recommendations in the coordinator's report. And this report or assessment states clearly that if Afghanistan wishes to, again, be accepted into the international community, it must fulfill its obligations as contained in international instruments which the state of Afghanistan is party to, most especially its human rights obligations. The report recommends the establishment of benchmarks to assess Taliban's policies and actions. Taliban representatives chose not to attend this meeting, but they may participate in the next round of UN meetings with the special representatives. The proposed process by the UN recommends the continuation of a large UN organized meetings, such as the one in February. In addition, appointment of a special envoy to oversee the political roadmap process, the development of an intra-Afghan dialogue, and commitment to regular consultations with civil society and women's groups inside and outside Afghanistan to inform this process. So in closing, I'll point out that for the first time since the Taliban takeover, we do have a proposed pathway which can facilitate a multilateral, integrated, and coherent approach for collective action among relevant political, humanitarian, and development actors. And Canada strongly supports such a process.
Thank you, Elyas. Just a couple questions, if I may. First of all, could you tell us a little bit more about perhaps the likelihood or the prospects of success of a UN-led roadmap?
Sure. A few things to note. So the report that I mentioned was supported, adopted by a UN Security Council resolution in December of last year. And the UN Secretary General is planning to consult and appoint an envoy, as recommended, to oversee the implementation of these recommendations. So this is good news. Secretary General himself, given his background as a former commissioner of UNHCR, he's very well informed and interested in Afghanistan related issues. At the last meeting, for example, which I attended, he spent almost 2 days in Doha, and at the beginning and end of every session, he intervened personally. And so this is really good to see it's the UN system, Secretary General himself being so personally engaged in this process. I would note that realistically, a political process, of course, will not be an easy thing. It will not be a quick process, given all the difficulties that we know as far as the Taliban's policies are concerned. But it offers steps, and some would call it incentives, for the Taliban as well to participate. And the proposals actually include very concrete confidence-building measures. This is a give-and-take style with Taliban and between the Taliban and international community. And then the other element that is, I think, interesting is that the creation of such a process will perhaps gradually strengthen the moderate or the so-called pragmatic Taliban. The other element, I think, also the fact that there will be a process overseen by the UN. This allows for greater understanding between the region and like-minded nations. We do not have such a process since the Taliban came over. As I mentioned, we have the like-minded community of countries and then regional countries. But the fact that they can work together and to an extent try to understand and come up with a set of mutual gains, net gains, that all participants and actors and stakeholders who work in and around Afghanistan can benefit from. So there is something for everybody in this process, the way it is potentially designed.
Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about how NGOs and civil society might contribute to this process?
Sure. As I noted, part of the report by the UN Special Coordinator focuses on the role of Afghan civil society and consultation with different Afghan stakeholders. And this commitment on the part of the UN is important. It actually officially would create a role for civil society actors, women's groups inside and outside Afghanistan. But we know at the same time that Afghanistan is a very diverse society. It's politically diverse, it's ethnically diverse. So we shouldn't have an expectation that all Afghan civil society actors and political groups will speak in one voice to help a process. But Afghan organizations within Afghanistan, of course, there are limitations in terms of how much they can participate because of restrictions from Taliban. But some of the representatives from Afghanistan and Afghan groups in diaspora, they can have more influence if they do form a more cohesive position, if it's not one voice and united, but at least there is a level of cohesion. It was very encouraging, for example, to see that just before the meeting that I mentioned in February in Doha, that so many Afghan groups, civil society groups, issued statements about their concerns about this process. As much as that was encouraging to see that, at the same time, we do recognize that when you have, let's say, at least 15 statements from different groups, it does make it, frankly speaking, a little hard for international actors to come up with a conclusion and try to understand what is actually being said. So perhaps for the next round of these meetings, if the civil society, NGOs, can come up with a more consolidated position, then it can feed into the process much better. And of course, that can be taken more seriously by the Taliban as well. But I would note that one interesting thing would be to look at the statements that were issued last month to come up with a summary of concerns and some of the positive things that are mentioned about the process, and then build on that. So those are some of the thoughts that I have. Over to you.
All right. Let's all warmly thank Elyas. Right. Now for our Icelandic visitor, and I understand actually that the City of Toronto is having the honor of hosting her for the first time. So yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Is it okay if I?
Oh yes, of course.
Feel free from over there.
Yeah.
Now you get the boring diplomat speech. But thank you so much, James, and let me tell you, it is an absolute pleasure to get to be with all of you here today, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone who identifies outside these two categories. I would like to start on a personal note. and take you briefly with me to the HQ, headquarters of the United Nations in New York, where I work on a daily basis as a diplomat representing Iceland. This is a work of art that you see on the screen, which was a gift from Afghanistan in June 2021. And it's a huge work of art. The screen doesn't show it, but it's 4 meters wide. And I walk past it on a daily basis. And I can tell you that this is the work of art that has most profoundly affected me at the UN. Because as you can see, it just exudes vitality, joy, beauty. And I need to tell you that after the reports started coming out of Afghanistan on the worsening human rights situation, the oppression of women, it became a little bit difficult for me to walk past this bundle of joy, so to speak. So for a while, I would almost look away because I thought it was difficult to see these people, that you just want to give a hug, especially the one that is running towards you. But then I started thinking about it differently, and I tried to think of it as an inspiration, which it should be, because it shows us the Afghanistan that can be. And so my thinking these days, when I walk out of conference room 1 at the UN and past this work of art, which, by the way, is by a group of artists called the Art Lords. When I walk past it now, I think to myself and to the people, the young people in this artwork, you will study again, and that's for the teenage girl in the corner studying a poem, and you will dance again. I think the two are equally important, actually. But now on to the policy of my government. And I see someone crying in the room, and I just have to say that the crying together today has been my favorite part and is very necessary. On to my government policy. Human rights, with a strong emphasis on gender equality, are a cornerstone of Iceland's policy, both at home and abroad. And in the past couple of years, we have repeatedly called for global attention to the quest of Afghan and Iranian women and girls for the rights to be respected, protected, and fulfilled. We have been actively engaging at the highest level of governments, including our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. And now I'll say a few words about our works in relation to Afghanistan and then Iran, respectively, because there are differences. In terms of Afghanistan, it's been a long-standing priority country in our international development cooperation. And throughout, we have placed particular emphasis on gender equality. So we're invested already. And to make a long story short, as a donor and partner, Iceland remains a partner, but we have had to temporarily adapt to a new reality. The temporary part is vital here, of course. We haven't done it by cutting funding. In fact, we have significantly increased humanitarian funding as the worsening humanitarian situation is extremely worrying. We continue to stress the importance of addressing the abject living conditions of Afghan women and girls in all their diversity as a top priority for my government. We strive to be a reliable, flexible, and predictable partner to UN agencies, the big general ones such as OCHA with the coordination of humanitarian affairs, UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, World Food Programme, UN Special Trust Fund for Afghanistan. But in terms of gender-specific activities, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, we support the UNFPA, the Population Fund of the UN, and UN Women in Afghanistan. And most recently, I'd like to highlight, we also work with the UN Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, given the priority we place on supporting Afghan women-led civil society organizations and women on the ground in Afghanistan. And this comes down to the nothing about us without us principle, which is vital. I cannot overemphasize the focus of my government on assisting Afghan women and girls to get back their hard-earned rights and freedom. We systematically make use of the possibilities we have in international fora to advocate for this in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, in New York at the General Assembly, and in Paris, where Iceland is a member of the UNESCO executive boards. This is education and culture. At UNESCO, we have 3 times played a leading role on Afghanistan-related resolution, and I'm pleased to inform we have worked closely with Canada, among other on mandating a high-level conference on the access of Afghan women and girls to education, with an emphasis on them participating in the conference themselves. I understand this is now being planned. On to the Islamic Republic of Iran, where our history of active engagement is shorter, but has been substantial, particularly at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where Iceland has in recent years been leading negotiations on resolutions related to Iran. In the autumn of 2022, Iceland, together with Germany, called for a special session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva to discuss human rights developments in the country following the nationwide protests. We have urged Iran to repeal and abolish all discriminatory laws, regulations, and procedures against women and girls, and to immediately dismantle any state machinery tasked with monitoring and enforcing coercive measures against women and girls. During the special session in 2022, Iceland and Germany put forward a resolution establishing an international independent fact-finding mission to investigate alleged human rights violations in Iran related to the protests that began that fall. And as was mentioned already today, the fact-finding mission's report came out today. They're not done. I'll get back to that later. The mission establishes, in this report that's become accessible, that Iran committed a series of extensive, sustained, and continuing acts of human rights violations directed against women, girls, and persons expressing support for gender equality and the rights of women and girls, and cumulatively constitute what the mission assesses to be gender persecution in the context of the protests and associated repression of fundamental rights. And I want to briefly pause to underline that gender persecution is codified as a crime against humanity, and the threshold for something to be classified as a crime against humanity is extremely high. Those are core international crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. Now back to what the mission has established in the report of today. Also, that gender persecution has taken place against the backdrop of an institutionalized system of discrimination and elements of segregation against women and girls, where Iranian women and girls have been severely deprived of a broad range of fundamental rights, including the right to life, the right to be free from torture, to freedom of expression, to freedom of religion, to public life, to bodily integrity and autonomy, and to access to education and to healthcare. Iceland believes it to be highly important that the fact-finding mission completes its work, and we have therefore shared a draft of a resolution calling for mandate renewals for both the special rapporteur, but also the fact-finding missions. And negotiations are actually taking place in Geneva this Monday. So this was a brief overview of our work in relation to Afghanistan and Iran. If we have some time, I might have a seat also and chat with you. But I also, in personal capacity, do some work as a co-facilitator within the legal committee of the General Assembly at the UN in New York. And we have heard multiple references to this process here today, so I thought it would be good to comment a little bit on that. I would like to emphasize that we are not yet negotiating. That's maybe the number one point that I would like to make. Secondly, I can say that this by far is the file on the table of the sixth committee that is garnering the most attention these days. If you just count the number of submissions, statements, meetings that are being held on the sidelines, etc., etc. The mandate that we have now is to discuss the substance of the draft articles, essentially a draft agreement, that the International Law Commission has sent over to the UN and asked us to make into a new UN agreement. We are still in the process of discussing the substance, but this fall, we are at crossroads, because then the legal committee will have to decide what to do next. And obviously, there are many, including my own country, that would like to proceed and enter negotiations on a new UN Crimes Against Humanity treaty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And just a follow-up question. Could you tell us a little bit more, perhaps, about the current status of these negotiations, including whether we might see an agreement, say, in the next 2 years, and whether we might see anything on gender apartheid?
Sure. You hear me? Okay, yes, absolutely. Okay, yeah, well, in one way, it's anyone guess what will happen, because it's the UN, and it's UN politics. But I would highlight that a new international agreement is a huge deal. It normally takes years for something like that to become an actual agreement. So I imagine that whatever happens will require some patience. But then again, the amount of pressure is high, I'd like to highlight. And even if you look at it, just look at the numbers of states that have been expressing opinions and what kind of opinions they have been expressing, that is going more in the direction of mandating a new international agreement. I will need to mention that, of course, there are differing opinions. There are some of my colleagues, states at the UN, that do think a new treaty is not needed. This is a smaller group. And I think, importantly, of course, everybody agrees that crimes against humanity, core international crimes, are something which we need to ensure accountability for. So we will see what happens, but all eyes on the General Assembly this fall in terms of decision-making on the process. But then in April, just next month, we will have another round, like we had last year, another round of discussions on the substance of the draft articles, the draft agreement. And we will also have discussions on the recommendation of the International Law Commission that we go ahead and make a new treaty. Then you asked about the gender apartheid aspects, which have been mentioned often today. And just to place ourselves in where things are actually, like factually speaking, we have a draft agreement. Nobody knows whether this would be the actual basis of negotiations, just to make that clear, that this would be the decision of the delegations, and we operate by consensus within the legal committee, importantly, which means we all have to agree on how to proceed on things. Gender apartheid is not in the draft that we are discussing now, and it has not been codified anywhere, at least as of yet. So there's a difference between gender apartheid and gender persecution, which, even if it hasn't been used a lot, is in the Rome Statute, for instance. And I will just be honest that in terms of gender apartheid, that even if, as we have heard today, this concept has existed for quite a while, for the legal advisor community in New York, it's very new. I would say that that's the general sort of sentiment. And I have to be honest that I myself didn't hear of this until last year. So that's where we are at. But there has been an extremely strong push lately from many different directions. So by now, the legal advisor community knows what gender apartheid is, and that there is a push for it to get into a new eventual UN agreement. And I would highlight also that states were able to make written submissions on the draft articles last December. There were, and I'll have to give credit to a person called Paloma van Grol, who's a native Canadian, who did the statistics of these submissions, published them online, and found out that, for instance, more than half of these submissions had something on the gender aspects, and 6 of them mentioned gender apartheid. So I think that's a very tangible example of how this concept is entering the discussions, even if, in the words of one activist that was explaining this to me, it's a nascent legal concept. And we have to make a distinction between using it politically and using it as a legal concept.
All right, well, that's good to hear. Let's warmly thank our guest from Iceland for graciously sharing her knowledge. Let's move straight into questions from the audience, given the time. Ooh, okay, so I saw back there first, and then I saw there, and I saw here. So let's take, oh, and there's one over there. So let's just take them all at once. 1, 2, 3, 4. Starting here.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question for all the panelists. It's a bit complex. I wanted to discuss the geopolitical motivations that underlie all the, I guess, trends and subjugation and oppression of the women we're seeing right now in Afghanistan. Specifically, I wanted to discuss a report written by the former Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan, Chris Alexander. And he wrote a report, and it was published, shortly after the takeover. He wrote an article in the Globe and Mail, as well as a report discussing basically Pakistan's proxy war in Afghanistan. And he encouraged the international community to take concerted, diplomatic efforts to end this proxy war. He argues in this article that Pakistan is committing an act of aggression under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And I guess what I'm trying to, ask here in this discussion is why do you think we're not discussing this topic more often in forums like this? There seems to be a lot of discussion, of course, on what's going on in Afghanistan, but there's not so much as to the root cause of this war. And I think that it's impossible to discuss how we can free women until we discuss what's actually causing this war. And do you think, how can we support women's rights without addressing this topic? The reason real quick. I want to get his quote right, so I'm going to look it up on the article. So what he says in this article is, the only way to stop the assassination squads terrorizing Afghan civilians or to save villages from further brutal violence is concerted international diplomatic and political action to shut down Pakistan's proxy war and we need to take the same firm action now that leading democracies took after Ukraine was invaded 7 years ago. So
thank
I
you.
just want to discuss this issue, like
Okay.
why, how can
Root
we free
cause.
women? Yeah.
Perfect. All about root cause. All right. Over
The root
here,
cause.
then here, then there was a woman over. Yes. Perfect. Okay.
I'm going to preface my comment, ending up with a question. The delusional beliefs of fanatics, which I consider to be parsing the whole conversation. $3 trillion have been wasted in Afghanistan via kinetics and non-kinetics with absolutely nothing to show. And the query is why? I believe, and I'm suggesting, I'll find out when I'm on the ground in Afghanistan next month on a special project for people that I'd rather not name, is that it's going to require moral courage and political leadership out of the box, existential, not concerned, not considered with crass transactional electoral or re-electoral politics at the home base, whether in Canada or the United States or even Iceland. And sadly, the United Nations is a very abused institution. It would be better served if it could be bifurcated into the entities when you have a member of the Security Council as an aggressing nation. And UN has done a great deal of positive, to which I can speak of since I've been involved with that for quite a few times. So my query question is, it's sad that the vulnerable lack a voice. Why is it allowed to happen when you hear their stories and the people here want merely to share their stories, their cri de coeur? Thank you.
Thank you. Over here. Go ahead. Oh, you're waiting for a mic, right? Okay.
Thank you so much. My first question is from Mr. Elyas, who highlighted the roadmap of Doha talk in order to negotiate with the Taliban. And I think this process actually going towards a very dangerous direction because, first of all, this is a narrative of Taliban saying international community and also human rights and women's rights activists have to have a cohesion among each other, that what they want. I think we have a special envoys there to highlight universal values that are important for every country with feminist foreign policy, that they have to put the Taliban accountable. I think we have to distinguish between those who want to work with the Taliban and engage with them, and those who want to eradicate a gender apartheid regime. We cannot have countries in the gray area, either with the people of Afghanistan or with the Taliban. So my question from Mr. Elyas is that Special Rapporteur, Mr. Richard Bennett, was not invited to Doha talk that you are talking about. This means the human rights narrative was missing from what you're talking in Doha talk, and now we're going to bring Taliban in the next round. You talk about hostage exchange, you talked about business, you talked about intelligence and security, not about human rights. And this is so dangerous for women of Afghanistan and for the people of Afghanistan. My question from Ms. Salma is, you are here. Thank you so much for championing human rights, women's rights so far. I just wanted to ask you, is there any way, because we are pushing this in the US Congress. US Congress introduced the Taliban Recognition Prohibition Act. Is there any way we can have something like that in Canada Congress? Also, sanctions that has not been elevated since the Taliban takeover can be imposed or not, because you also have Special Economic Measure Act, you also have Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, you also have the right to adopt regulation under the United Nations Act. These three acts can target individuals who are perpetrators of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And lastly, right here.
Hi, thank you everybody for being here. As the senator pointed out, sort of a justification for non-intervention that we'll hear from, the center to the right is that it doesn't matter, that Afghanistan and women don't matter, or Iran and women don't matter. But there's another, sort of theoretical approach that you'll see often on the left, that feminism itself as a political concept is an imperial or colonial imposition on these societies that is unwanted often by the women themselves. I'm wondering, number one, is there any truth to that historically or now? And number two, how do you counter that narrative if it is something that is truly wanted by the population, especially when working in progressive circles?
Thanks so much. Some loaded questions there. I'll just comment. Like I think someone said earlier that we got Afghanistan women got the vote in 1919, and then like in Quebec, like people got the vote women got the vote in like 1960 or something. So I mean, I think that answers that right there. But let's start with Salma to answer the questions.
Thank you. To the young lady who was referring to Chris Alexander's article, I disagree with Chris Alexander. Chris Alexander, by the way, was a colleague, a very dear colleague. We are friends. But I disagree. What's happening in Afghanistan right now, it's not the fault of Pakistan. Pakistan, where the women are liberated. Many Afghan families have moved to Pakistan so they can educate their girls. I personally know some. And the reason they say that we can no longer stay in Afghanistan is because the girls will not have an education. I think we need to start taking a look at reality, what happened. And you put it beautifully. There's a joke going around which says it took the US 20 years, $3 trillion to take Afghanistan from the Taliban to hand it back to the Taliban. Because basically that's what happened. I think the women, so I worked, we talk about the UN, but there's another organization which I'm very passionate about. It's the IPU. I don't know how many of you have heard of the IPU. Hands? Has anybody heard? One person, two. So the reason I'm passionate about working with IPU is because you meet the parliaments of the world. It's the Interparliamentary Union. It predates the League of Nations. So that means it's older than the UN. And you have parliamentarians coming there. When you go to the UN, you're mostly talking to government. And Afghanistan had a huge presence in the IPU. And one year when I was there, I came back to the Canada desk. I had to attend some meetings, and they told me, this young woman from Afghanistan has come looking for you 3 times. She wants to talk to you. So I went. I said, who's looking for me? And she was all of 26 years old and a member of the Shura. And she said, I want to run for the Human Rights Committee. Can you tell me how to run? So I told her, come on, let's have a coffee and let's discuss this. She was running opposite an Australian. The next day, the Australian came to the Canada desk and said, oh my, the young lady from Afghanistan is doing so well. I don't know what to do. And I kind of looked down because I'd been the one who had been, just supporting and mentoring. This is what you do. She became a member of that committee and became the chair of that committee. So, the women of Afghanistan have that capability if they're given the opportunity. I have seen it firsthand. And what you say is true. I always say, and no offense to anyone, the different systems work in different countries. So when we want to give a helping hand, we have to make sure that we don't impose our system on those countries. The women in Afghanistan, the way they live, the women in Pakistan, the women in Iran, in India, their realities are different. And they make gains. But straight away, it's you don't expect a baby to be born and start running. You have to give them time to sit, learn to stand and then start walking. And I always say, don't impose, a certain kind of civilization on different countries, because there's a different set of values, there's a different way of looking at things. But you know, women were 30% in the parliament in Afghanistan, and then along come the Taliban, and you know, under the pretext of protecting women, ask them to stay home. Why? Our men are not used to looking at women. I mean, give me a break. What kind of a reason is that? And I myself have a question for the gentleman from Doha: is if like-minded countries are talking, then what's the point? Do you all agree? Yeah. Okay. We have to wrap up another time, maybe.
His order is over there. So yes. Apologies to Elyas and Anna. If anyone wants to come up and talk to our panelists, presuming they're willing to stick around and ask some questions. Okay. All right. So whoever's ready to talk for a minute, 1 minute from each.
Sure. Should I go first?
You're ready, so.
All right. Well, I will have to say a few words about the UN because it came up in the audience. And I want to say that the UN isn't perfect, certainly not. Neither is its membership, but it's what we have. And we have to continue to improve it because without it, we are worse off. On the whole roadmap question, no detailed comments, no time, of course, but just to emphasize in general, yes, the importance of human rights and women at the table. Which brings me to the final point, the importance of supporting women human rights defenders within Afghanistan and Iran, as well as outside, of course. So that would be a priority for us that I want to highlight. Thanks very much for today.
I want to take this 1 minute, maybe 30 seconds. Okay, yes, okay.
Elyas, can you hear us? Elyas, can you say something?
Okay, yeah, sure. Just
1
very
minute.
specifically and very clearly, I have to point out that Canada's position on women's rights and human rights is absolutely clear. There is no doubt. The reason Canada supports the UN roadmap is, in fact, because it is very much aligned to what Canada has been saying for the last 20 years on Afghanistan. Women's rights is not negotiable, and if one were to look at the UN coordinator's report, that's basically what it's saying. We don't have a concern. This is why we support the report. As I mentioned, two groups. Like-minded, yes, we agree, but the world is not just like-minded. So we do have very influential players in the region who don't necessarily have the same priority as us. We need to work with them. This UN process allows that, something that hasn't been done. Last point, we as Canada, we consult with Afghan groups, but we cannot represent them at the table. This is why there's a need for Afghan groups within Afghanistan outside, an Afghan-led process where they do come up with a cohesive position on their own. And if Canada were to sit at the table and try to represent Afghans, I don't think Afghan groups would want us. So that is why it was my comment that there's a Canadian position that's very clear. On the other hand, Afghan groups, with the diversity that they have, we would encourage them to come up with a more cohesive voice, and we can convey the message, but of course we can't represent them. Last point, I know time is running out on Pakistan, the question of Pakistan. You know, things didn't turn out so well for Pakistan. Pakistan did offer a permissive environment for Taliban for 20 years, but right now, government of Pakistan every day is accusing Afghan Taliban of harboring TTP or Pakistani Taliban. So Afghan Taliban are, in fact, not cooperating with government of Pakistan the way government of Pakistan expected it. So whether it was the root cause before or not, right now, things have changed. Over.
Payam, are you coming back up to wrap things up? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right.
Thank you very much, James, and to our incredible panel, and apologies for being the bad guy, but a round of applause for our panel. So it falls on me just to share with you some last words. First of all, I think you will agree that this has been really an epic journey. If we think about the extraordinary people who have been with us today. Some people who are truly heroines, champions, source of incredible inspiration, but also those who, as I said at the outset, have experienced firsthand the grief and anguish of the hatred and the violence, the misogyny, which sometimes for us is an abstraction sitting here in our Canadian bubble. So thank you for your voices. Thank you for reminding us why silence is not an option, why we have to do what we can. I want to just thank a number of people, the sponsors, Massey College, of course, Alyssa Ginsberg, my esteemed, outstanding co-chair, Rizal, for which I want to give a round of applause. The Omidyar Institute of Iranian Studies, dear friend Mohammed, thank you very much for your support. The International Human Rights Program at the Faculty of Law, Catherine Amifar, Debevoise and Plimpton, thank you very much for your support. Other than thanking the poets, the panelists, the moderators, the speakers, I also want to thank Joe Costa, our amazingly cordial and competent technical person. Thank you. Just to wrap up, you remember in the morning I spoke about Massey College's motto, where people and ideas intersect. As I said then, the ideas that we're looking at, human rights, gender persecution, are very important, but the people who've come here are even more important. It's the people who've come around those ideas that matter most. And since from our part of the world, we always have to have a poem for something, I am reminded here of the immortal words of Fariduldin Attar from Nishabur, from Khorasan, which is the bridge really between Iran and Afghanistan, this historic area. And his great epic called Mantiqul Tayr, the Conference of the Birds. All my Afghan friends are nodding their head, my Iranian friends, because we know this epic about a group of birds who set out to discover their king, mythical king in a mountain. And as they go through this very long and exhausting journey, some drop out because of despair, because of exhaustion, because of doubt about whether this king actually exists. And in the end, those who remain see their own reflection on the mountain and realize that the king which they sought, the sovereign which they sought, is in fact their own reflection. And I mention this because one of the takeaways, and I want to just put 3 concrete ideas out here as a result of this coming together. Well, the first thing is you have to organize yourselves. You have to organize yourselves. Does not need to be some very specific organization, but these conversations, these collaborations, these networks are the beginning of many great things. I have here, I think, my friend Hamed Esmailun, who's outside of this room, but those of you in Canada will be familiar with the families of the victims of Flight PS752, the Ukraine aircraft that was shot down over Iran, which 55 Canadian citizens were killed, many of whom, such as Hamed, lost their families. And they are an exceptionally inspiring group who showed extraordinary resilience in organizing themselves, mobilizing public opinion, persuading the government of Canada to take the Islamic Republic of Iran to the International Court of Justice. So I think that this first lesson is we have to talk to each other, we have to collaborate, we have to mobilize. No one's going to do it for you, and your voices matter. The second is the importance of accountability mechanisms, and I want to thank once again the government of Iceland for its key role in establishing the fact-finding mission, which today put out a report, and you will already see some of the horrific instances of sexual violence and use of rape in Iran's prison system, which is one of the important features of the conclusion that this was a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, qualifies as crimes against humanity. We have the International Criminal Court, which hopefully will soon progress its investigation on gender persecution in Afghanistan. And we have the prospect of a case under the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women before the International Court of Justice if we find a willing government. Which brings me to the third point and the most important point. If we look back at feminist conceptions of power, one of those conceptions is what is very often dismissed in diplomacy as soft power, or simply forces which are irrelevant to what we are very often told are power realities. So building culture is perhaps the most important arena of resistance. It may not bring immediate results in a way that war and violence may, or shifts of political power which replace one group of tyrants with another, but in fact, the seismic shifts which really make a difference come from the bottom up, and they happen in the trenches of the everyday, which I referred to earlier, those who educate future generations, the conversations around dinner tables, those who are reaching out in their communities, in their neighborhoods, and extending compassion and helping their sisters. So I just will end here by saying that I hope at the very least that this gathering has opened a conversation, that we have made new friends, new networks, new ideas, new strategies. This will be a long historical struggle. Those of us from Iran have been waiting just a brief 50 years to go back to our countries, but we can never give up. We can never give up. And even if we don't see the fruits of our struggles, perhaps future generations will remember that we did not remain silent. So I will end simply by saying that Nur bar tariki piruz khahad shod. The light shall prevail over darkness. Yes, Mohammed?
You just forgot mentioning someone and thanking.
Yes.
Professor Hiram Aharon.
Oh. Not at all, not at all. No, no. It was my real pleasure. So thank you, everyone. Safe trip home. And hopefully we will have another gathering to celebrate some victory or other. Thank you.